My name is Wynn Langer. I'm a librarian here. And for this event, I really want to send a shout out to the League of Women Voters who's co-hosting this with us. Yeah. And also, of course, to the friends who just support us in all of the events that we have. Like I said, the League of Women Voters of the Glendale and Burbank chapter are co-hosting this event. And I would like to introduce Ms. Mary Dixon, who is the president of this chapter, to say a few words.
Thank you, Wynn. So we're so excited to be here tonight to participate with the Burbank Buena Vista Public Library in presenting author and professor Ellen Carroll Dubois, who will be speaking about her book, newly published book, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. The publication of this book coincides with the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and also the formation, the 100th anniversary of the formation of the League of Women Voters. This organization was formed after ratification to help educate women who were voting for the first time. The League continues to serve that purpose today, not just for women, but for all citizens. We conduct nonpartisan candidates forums. We present pros and cons about ballot propositions and offer voter registration information. We advocate for democracy itself, and we oppose restrictions on voting. And we also work to oppose unfair elections, by such things as gerrymandering. We also study important issues which affect us all, including issues like healthcare, global warming, and transportation, just to name a few of the issues that our group has studied. I was introduced to the League of Women Voters nearly 40 years ago when I worked in a public library, and the assistant director there invited me to a League meeting. This simple gesture by an accomplished woman reaching out to a young college student changed my life by empowering me with the knowledge of hundreds of women in the town and state where I was, to be informed about issues, and I was encouraged to study them. This is what the League does best. Inspiring women and men also to be more involved in their communities and their states and even this nation. The movement described in Professor Dubois' books evidences the tenacity and determination of the many women who demanded simple justice. That's the right to vote in elections. It can be hard for many of us today to realize that just 100 years ago, women did not have these protections, and that many forces work to deprive women and other citizens from exercising their right to vote and other rights to participate in society, like the simple act of the right to speak in public. So I am very pleased to have been asked to speak tonight so that I can exercise my right to speak in public. And I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Dubois. So I will turn it back over to Wynn now.
Thank you, Mary. We're also celebrating Women's History Month, the month of March, so this is great timing for everything to come together. Dr. Dubois, right? Yes, is a distinguished research professor in the history department at UCLA. She's known for her pioneering work in women's history. In 1998, she won the John Kelly Memorial Prize for the American Historical Association for her book about Harriet Stanton Blatch. She's the author of numerous books on women's suffrage, and she has co-authored the leading textbook on women's history, Through Women's Eyes, an American History with Documents. So without further ado, let's have Dr. Ellen Carroll Dubois.
How many of you are League of Women Voter people? Oh! Great. Well, I'll just say two things about the League of Women Voters, besides the fact that it's the legacy organization from the suffrage movement. First of all, the League of Women Voters used to sponsor the presidential debates, and then something terrible happened. They were given to the broadcasting networks. And we know how well that has turned out. So we miss the League of Women Voters a lot. The other is that the League of Women Voters is, one of the things I say about this subject is that although the women's suffrage movement ended 100 years ago, as a campaign to extend and defend democracy, it wasn't over 100 years ago. And you could say that, among other things, it's very much connected to the effort to eradicate and fight back against voter suppression, which is a denial of democracy. And the League of Women Voters is, I think, the leading national organization to take on voter suppression. So that puts it in, that means that it's keeping up its very distinguished tradition. So thank you all for coming out. And, you know, none of us will be leaving our homes for the next month, so enjoy yourself.
We have a good book to read.
That's right. All right, so I'm going to, in a little more than 45 minutes, a little bit, I'll go to a little bit after 8. I'm going to cover a very long history. The history of the campaign for women's suffrage was 75 years old, and I'm going to do it in, it's sort of like speed dating. I'm going to do it in about 50 minutes. And I'm going to, the topic, the talk is called The Surprising Road to Women's Suffrage. I'm going to talk through 4 different surprises, which will lead us through those 75 years. Okay, so let us begin. Surprise number 1. The Woman's Suffrage Constitutional Amendment that never was. Okay. On Election Day, November 5th, 1872, presidential election day, hundreds of women around the country, perhaps as many as 1,000 or more, went to their local polling places and announced that they were going to vote for president. Like now, you went to your polling place. I mean, you had a box to put your vote in, which probably made it safer than it is now. But like today, you know, there would be people sitting there from both parties, and they would be in charge of administering the polling place. So Anthony, Susan B. Anthony, oh, wait, I skipped that. These women came from all over they were in all states of the country, including the relatively young state of California. Women in Santa Cruz and the Santa Clara Valley went to their polling places and declared themselves voters. And that's what this woman is doing. She's probably in New York City. She's announcing her right to vote. Now, the most famous of these voting women was this woman, Susan B. Anthony. She was actually the most famous suffrage advocate of her day. Now, you can see in this cartoon, this is not entirely flattering. She is, on the one hand, she's made to look very like a man. She looks like a man. On the other hand, she is a kind of female version of Uncle Sam. She goes up to the guy who was running the polling place, who happened to be a Republican, and she explained to him why she had the right to vote, although he said to her, the state of New York, the Constitution says women can't vote. It didn't, by the way, but he said that. Her case was based on the recently ratified, 4 years before, 14th Amendment, the most important part of the Constitution to this day, the most highly litigated part of the Constitution. So this is the first paragraph, the first section of the 14th Amendment. Okay, this first sentence is of enormous importance. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof That meant, for instance, if you were the child of a diplomat from Britain, you weren't under that category. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, this may surprise you, but this was the first time that the U.S. Constitution declared national citizenship. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution to declare who is a national citizen, who is a citizen of the country, and as the rest of the sentences in this section go on to say, what it means to be a citizen of the United States. So Susan B. Anthony said, I am, of course, a woman, but I am a person, all persons born in the United States, and therefore I am a citizen of the United States. And then she goes on, she says, using the rest of the section, she says, like all the other citizens of the United States, I have privileges and immunities of national citizenship, of the citizens of the United States, and no state shall deprive me or any person of these privileges and immunities of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And I am due the equal protection of the laws. You've heard several of these phrases, through most of your adult life. Equal protection of the laws, privileges and immunities, due process of law. These are often cited. That's all right here. But then she says, who can deny that among the privileges and immunities of national citizenship, which I deserve the equal protection of the laws, obviously privileges and immunities of citizenship include the right to vote. And either the man who was in charge of the ballot box was convinced, or more likely, he could see she was going to vote for Grant, and that was his candidate, so what did he care? So he let her vote. She was very happy, very excited. She goes home, she writes a letter to her best friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she said, I've gone and done and voted. I've cast my vote for Grant. A couple days later, there's a knock on her door, and there is a federal marshal, a member of the federal court, an officer of the federal court. And he tells her that she's under arrest. And she's under arrest for, there weren't many federal laws, federal criminal laws, but there was one that had been passed in the aftermath of the Civil War that said that if someone who didn't have the right to vote, voted with criminal intent, they could be arrested under federal law. Now, this law was directed at former Confederates. It was obvious that the Northern government was trying to keep secessionists, treasonous Confederates from voting and undoing the victory of the Civil War. It was not meant to be directed against a middle-aged lady of prudent nature like Susan B. Anthony. In the subsequent trial, which was conducted it was a federal trial, and it was conducted actually by a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Because at that point, Supreme Court justices did what was called ride circuit. So this man, whose name was Ward Hunt, was responsible for the northern part of New York. His conduct of the trial was highly controversial in many ways, but most amazingly, when the cases were presented and it was time for the jury to make a decision, he said to the jury, I'm not going to allow you to make a decision. The case is so clear-cut, by which he meant she's a woman and she voted, that's all that he thought the case was about, that I'm going to direct you to find a verdict of guilty. And he did that. He did this in such a way that Anthony could not appeal her case, which drove her crazy. She had visions of being the person to take this case, to take this argument all the way up to the Supreme Court. She didn't do so, but one of these other voting women, another woman who attempted to vote in 1872, a woman from St. Louis named Virginia Minor, did. She wasn't allowed to cast her ballot. And so she sued the election official who kept her from casting her ballot. She sued him. And that case, Virginia Minor versus Reese Happersett was the guy who said, no, you can't do it, was only the second time that the Supreme Court of the United States ever had considered a case that had to do with women's rights. Okay, so, wait, I think I missed one. Yeah, so this is what the Supreme Court looks like, okay? Yeah, all right. So the court ruled in 1875 that most of the case, Virginia Minor and Susan B. Anthony were right. Women were persons, therefore they were citizens, therefore they were due the privileges and immunities of national citizenship. But voting was not a privilege of national citizenship. And so the 14th Amendment did not grant them the right to vote. Instead, voting was, as the US Constitution had not said anything about who could vote. It said that Congress could decide how elections were conducted, where and in what manner, but the basic conduct of elections were left in the hands of the states, where, if you think about it, you know, it still resides. That's because what it takes to vote in California is different than what it takes to vote in Mississippi. The states still control the right to vote. And by dismissing Virginia Minor's case, the Supreme Court left the right to vote as it had been written in the Constitution in the hands of the states. I'll come back to this in a minute. This action of the Supreme Court in this relatively small case about women's rights was a signal of things to come. In the next within the next year, the Supreme Court took a series of decisions which have been much more noticed by constitutional scholars, in which they undid the 15th Amendment, which gave black men, former slave men, the right to vote. They allowed all kinds of what Susan B. Anthony called cunning devices on the part of states to get around the 15th Amendment insistence that by virtue of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, former enslaved men could not be denied the right to vote. Once the Supreme Court had ruled against these voting women, the suffragists were not ready to give up. Now they decided they needed to put forward their own amendment. And this is a picture of a cartoon of Susan B. Anthony's political partner in crime, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Here she is speaking before the Senate Judiciary Committee. You can see there's some women in the crowd, and actually there's Anthony sitting by her side. But the members of the committee are all men, of course. And this is the amendment that she proposed. It is not the amendment that became the 19th Amendment. This amendment follows the same logic that Susan B. Anthony and the other voting women had put forward. It says, the right of suffrage in the United States shall be based on citizenship and shall be regulated by Congress and all citizens of the United States. This was exactly the argument that Anthony and Minor had made. Citizens, whether native or naturalized, shall enjoy this right equally. And then it's just the last phrase, which makes reference to women's suffrage without any distinction or discrimination, whatever founded on sex. But we're now already in 1878. The country is tired of Reconstruction and of reformulating the Constitution. It's in no mood to undertake any further constitutional amendments. As Elizabeth Stanton said, the constitutional door had slammed shut. And after the 15th Amendment was passed, there was no constitutional amendment passed until well into the 20th century. The door had slammed shut. From then on, the suffragists pursued a different kind of amendment. This amendment was patterned exactly on the 15th Amendment, the three of the great Reconstruction amendments. So the 15th Amendment said, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of. And whereas the 15th Amendment said race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the suffragists substituted the word sex. And then there's a sentence giving Congress the right to do what's called enforcement legislation. Now, this is the wording that eventually became, 40 years later, the 19th Amendment. I just want to compare these two amendments, the Woman Suffrage Amendment that never was and the Woman Suffrage Amendment that eventually was. They are different in two basic and important ways. The first one, the Woman Suffrage Amendment that never was, which I call the Universal Suffrage version, speaks in the affirmative. It says, the right of suffrage shall be based. You get it. National citizens get the right to vote. The final Woman Suffrage Amendment is put in the negative. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged. So it's posed in the negative. And then closely related to that is that the Universal Suffrage Amendment that never was makes it clear that it's shifting the right to vote to the national government under the control of Congress and connecting it to national citizenship. Whereas the Woman Suffrage Amendment that finally was does not change the original intent of the Constitution and leaves the right to vote in the hands of the states where it remains. We should note that had the Woman Suffrage Amendment that never was actually gotten anywhere, and it was quite a high bar to cross, we would be in a very different situation than we are now. We would be in a situation in which the federal government and Congress has constitutional control over the right to vote. Congress does not have that, especially since the Voting Rights Act was undone by the Supreme Court several years ago. Today we would be, as a nation, far less vulnerable to what I spoke of when I first started, which is the practice of voter suppression, which originates from the fact that the right to vote is under the control of the states, and that the federal government and Congress and the courts has very little control over the states in attacking voter suppression. The shift to the language from the universal suffrage version that never was to the final version of the Woman Suffrage Amendment had another consequence. And this was in the suffrage movement's racial character. The woman suffrage movement had begun in the 1850s in connection with the abolitionist movement. And so all of the first generation of women suffragists were abolitionists first, and then they became women's rights and women's suffrage advocates. But now, now that we are in the 80s, the 1880s, the government, the country is quite tired of the Civil War and the conflict between North and South and the battle over slavery. It was descending into a period that we call the Jim Crow years, the period of white supremacy, of insurgent racial violence in the post-slavery era. This is, there are two different images I'm going to show you. both of them dealing with the fact that in its last 3 or 4 decades, the mainstream women's suffrage movement was overwhelmingly white in its character and was not very welcome to black women. This is an image that actually is criticizing that practice. It comes from a magazine called The Crisis, which was the magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And so it says, so here is a white suffragist saying votes for women, but she's got her hand up against the black woman, who also has a sign that says votes for women. And at the top of the cartoon it says, just like the men. And at the bottom it says, votes for white women. Now, this reputation for this strong inclination to racial exclusivity, and at times outright racism, tainted the suffrage movement for the next 40 years, and continued to do so even after 1920, and tainted the movement's legacy. Having said that, there are 2 qualifications I want to make of this. First of all, although many, perhaps most of the suffragists in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of the white suffragists, were not particularly welcoming of black women, that was not always the case. There were, for instance, white women who were among the founders of the NAACP in the early 20th century. These are 2 stained glass windows from the major black church, the African Methodist Episcopal African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Rochester, Susan B. Anthony's hometown. And the one on the left is a stained glass window dedicated to Susan B. Anthony. You can sort of see her image faintly in the oval. This means that she was really revered until the day she died certainly by the African American community that knew her best, that of her hometown of Rochester. The other thing, besides the fact that a minority of white suffragists still did defend racial equality, is that there were always African American women and men, and their numbers were growing by the end of the 19th century, who were determined proponents of women's enfranchisement. The man on the left is one of the founders of the NAACP, a man named W.E.B. Dubois. I like to think of him as my grandfather, but he wasn't. And the woman on the left is a woman named Anna Julia Cooper, who was a professor at Howard, an educator in Washington, D.C., an important suffragist. And then here are a couple other black suffragists of these years. This woman, Harriet Purvis, is from Boston. No, this woman is from Philadelphia, Harriet Purvis. This woman, Mrs. Ruffin, St. Pierre Ruffin, was from Boston. And this woman, who you can see by the picture is from an earlier period, you can see it's a very old daguerreotype, was a woman named Mary Ann Shadd Carey, who left the United States in 1850 when the fugitive slave law was passed, and she fled to Canada and remained there until after the Civil War, and then came back to be part of a vibrant African American community in Washington, D.C. Okay, so that's the first surprise, the women's suffrage amendment that never was. Here's the second surprise. Now we're in the later part of the 19th century. For the time being, as I indicated, the constitutional door had been slammed shut, and the task facing suffragists now was to use our own modern terms, to build their base, to make the demand for voting rights meaningful to the average woman. So this illustration from a ladies' magazine of the period gives us a sense of what the female face of America in the last quarter of the 19th century was. Such a woman was from a small town, she was white, she was Protestant and church-going, and she was a wife and mother. She was pious, she was domestic, and she was maternal. and her concerns, she was understood to be, I'm not talking about what actual human women were one by one, but she was understood to be a selfless defender of the concerns of her family and especially of her children. Such a woman, a married woman, a mother, owned no property, paid no taxes. So when somebody said no taxation without representation, what did that mean to her? She paid no taxes. And she cared little for the political issues and controversies that their fathers and husbands and sons cared deeply about. Abstract claims, such as those that Susan B. Anthony had pressed forward of universal justice and equal rights, had little meaning to her. How might such a woman understand the importance and power of women's suffrage? So the answer is women's suffrage was first connected to the daily lives of these, let us call them conventional women, not radicals like Susan B. Anthony, and much larger groups of women, not by the arguments of the suffragists themselves, but by this organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Anybody here has a grandmother or great-grandmother who was in the WCTU? Okay. Well, maybe you do and don't know. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, let me tell you a little bit about it. This is the way the WCTU is remembered in public memory. A bunch of axe-wielding harridans who only wanted to deny men their little pleasures. You know, all the men wanted to do is leave home, get a beer, get away from the old lady, and they weren't causing anyone any harm. And these axe-wielding women who wanted to destroy saloons were their sworn enemies. Well, that's not entirely the major story. First of all, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and this is a picture of a California union in the 1910s, was the largest women's organization in the turn of the century. I think this, the reason that temperance, criticism of alcohol, became a women's issue and ultimately a feminist issue shouldn't surprise too many of you. The argument is that, and it's a compelling argument, is that the major abusers of alcohol are men, and they abuse their families by drinking up their wage packets, and that alcohol leads to high levels of domestic abuse, of violence against women and children. That's the way the WCTU starts. But within a decade after it forms, its leadership moves it in favor of the right to vote. And it becomes the first large organization of women outside of these small radical suffrage groups to advocate women's suffrage. Now, the person who's responsible for this brilliant maneuver is this woman. Her name was Frances Willard, and in the 1890s, she was the most famous woman in the United States. She was an educator. She was the first dean of what would become Northwestern University. Her parents were abolitionists. She was a pious Methodist. And she approached women's suffrage. Oh, and this picture is my favorite picture of her. She wrote a book called How I Learned to Ride a Bicycle. How I Learned to Ride a Bicycle. And in the 1880s, a bicycle was to women what a driver's license was to us. It meant you could get where you wanted to go on your own. It was mobility. So Frances Willard decides probably in her 40s that she's going to learn to ride a bike, and she wrote a little book about it. She doesn't look all that comfortable here. As these two young women hold her up in the way that your father held you up when you learned to ride a bicycle. But she did learn to ride a bicycle. Now, Willard approached women's suffrage differently than than Anthony did. She didn't approach the right to vote as an issue of abstract justice or equal rights with men. Her contention, and this is the way she convinced her organization to become pro-suffrage, is that women must have the vote not because they had the same rights and the same capacities and the same obligations as men, but because their obligations and capacities and their duties were different than men, were fundamentally different. Her argument was that women needed to leave their homes, to leave their domestic realm, and go out into public using the tool of the vote in order to do what they were put on earth to do, which is defend their families, defend their families and their children. She captured this argument by replacing the term women's suffrage, which was already a term that sort of seemed too radical to conventional women, and she renamed the right to vote the home protection ballot. You can see how brilliant this is. So she's saying you need the right to vote, you need to go out into the political realm to protect your homes. It's sort of like, I said this the other day, whether you agree with this or not, it's sort of the way that the abortion rights campaign named itself pro-choice, okay? It's a kind of, it's a relatively benign term used to introduce a much more controversial and radical issue. So the brilliance of this approach is that I use this cartoon to show, it vaulted the conventional woman outside of her enclosed domestic arena over the edge of the woman's sphere, where clearly this cartoon is meant to criticize that, where she's only concerned with fashion and dolls and gossip, out into the larger world. Now, Willard died relatively young in the 1890s, but this approach, which was that the vote for women was important not just as a principle of abstract justice, but a tool for women to use to address issues that they, as distinct from men, cared about, was continued in a somewhat more modern way. American women were changing. Here we are in the early 20th century. The nation is less rural and more urban, still primarily Protestant, but there's a large groups of Catholics and Jews, certainly an enormous, much larger percentage than now in our country of immigrants. And women themselves were less exclusively domestic. Almost a quarter of the labor force was female in this period. So you see here a kind of similar argument. Here, this woman who's using a shovel, sort of like a broom, is used to clean up the dirty pool of politics, just like she cleans her home. Can we clean it? Yes, give us a chance. And then over here are various concerns. Let us note two of them. Food adulteration, that would be particularly the fact that milk was not required to be homogenized and pasteurized, and it could be very dangerous. And then the third one, which is white slavery, which is trafficking in women, sexual trafficking in women. I want to show you, before I leave this, so the kinds of issues that women were using the vote, women were coming into the suffrage movement because they were concerned with, the kinds of issues that were, in some ways, women were more concerned with, were things like the factory conditions in which this large female labor force worked, urban living conditions, public health and sanitation, and perhaps the issue that concerned women the most, the scourge of child labor. And these are two, this period is a period of great documentary photography in the early 20th century. And these are photographs from some of the great photographic social commentators of the period. This one on the left is, I think, by a man named Jacob Riis. And you see here, these are urban children, immigrant children, no doubt, playing on the street by a dead horse, okay? And then on the right, we have a picture of the kinds of conditions that women factory workers are working. This is a bookbinding factory. Okay, so now we go to the third surprise. So here we're in about from 1890 to 1910, and I'm telling you that women were using the vote to address these issues. How is it that women are using political power to vote on issues important to them at the local and the state level decades before the 19th Amendment is ratified? And here is the third surprise, perhaps the biggest. By this time, many American women were already veteran voters. How was that possible? Well, if you will remember at the first surprise, I talked about how the Constitution leaves the right to vote in the hands of the states, and that hadn't changed because of Reconstruction. What this meant is that with the possibility of a U.S. constitutional amendment closed to them for the time being, suffragists now turned to the separate states because those states had the capacity to amend their constitutions to enfranchise women. And here, let me emphasize, and I'll say this again because it's sort of counterintuitive. When a state amended its state constitution, removing the word male or adding the word female, the women who got the right to vote at that point got full voting rights. They didn't just get the right to vote for their state legislature, they got the right to vote for Congress and for president. Okay, they got full voting rights because control over voting rights had been left to the states. Now, perhaps this picture on the right. This is an image of women in Wyoming voting, and you can see by the way they're dressed. This is probably about 1890. Now, some of you may think that you heard that women in Wyoming voted from 1869. Women in Wyoming voted from 1869, but then Wyoming was still a territory. And voters in a territory could not vote for national office. They could just vote for the territorial legislature. So it's not until Wyoming becomes a state in 1890 and under tremendous pressure that the legislatures who draw up the first state constitution for Wyoming in 1890 hold on to this right of women to vote, and Wyoming comes into the Union with women voters. There's a more complex story about Utah, which I'd be happy to talk to you about if you'd like. Okay. The first time that voters of a state, let me say it differently. The first time that women get the right to vote, full voting rights, because the men who vote in their state vote on a referendum to give women the right to vote, is 3 years later in Colorado, a state that's 7 times as big as Wyoming in terms of population, and a much more booming economy. It's a big mining economy. And I love this picture because these women, you can see as they go into their polling place, I don't even know the words to say it. They are so pleased with themselves, and they are so, I'm voting and I have a right to do it. Both of them, with their hands on their hips like, I'm going in and I'm voting. So 1893, the Constitution of the state of Colorado is changed. That means, and I want to emphasize this point because it becomes increasingly important in the story. That means in the presidential elections after that, 1896, 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1916, the women of Colorado vote for President of the United States. Okay? Okay, now some of you may And this is one of the Colorado suffragists. Her name is Elizabeth Ensley. You can see she's an African-American woman. She was an educator also in Washington, D.C., and then she moved to Denver, where she was not just the person who was organizing the small black community of Denver, but also an officer in the Colorado Women's Suffrage Association. All right, now some of you may remember this from a few years ago. So Wyoming, Colorado, there are a couple more, Washington, one of the Dakotas, and one other state. California was the sixth, as they called it, free state or suffrage state. In 1911, California, and so now we're in the middle of a period of great reform called the Progressive Era, and California is one of the states with a strong progressive movement. The men of California, the women of California organize a campaign, and they convince the men of California to amend their constitution. And California brings its women into full voting rights. The California campaign is the first truly modern 20th century campaign. The kinds of women who ran this campaign, two groups are particularly important: college graduates. At this point, actually, the number of college graduates is much smaller in terms of percentage of the population. But women were the majority of college graduates in the West. Women actually were allowed to go to Cal from the beginning, okay? Whereas in the East, there were men's colleges and women's colleges. In the West, there are what are called land-grant coeducational colleges, public universities. And then the other big category is wage workers, women wage workers, who I've been talking about for a few minutes. In addition, a second way that the suffrage movement has become more modern is that it's using modern technology. So here on the upper right, there were movies made, melodramas, the kind that people paid a nickel to go into their Nickelodeons to see, and they were made on the issue of women's suffrage. They had the same kind of plots, except in this case, the hero would be a heroine, would be a suffragist. And almost always, each of these movies, and you can find some of these movies, and you can see them on Netflix or buy them, copies of them. They almost always had an actual suffragist included to give a speech. You know, these are silent movies, so she's going, and you see what she's saying. So I think that's Anna Howard Shaw. This is a picture. This was a big deal in California because it was a big state, and by now women are riding in and occasionally driving automobiles. Sometimes they were driven by men. And they would get in their automobiles in the big cities, and then they would drive out to the small towns, and they would go to the central square of the small town, and one woman would stand up, as this woman is, and toot a trombone, and then the other one would stand up and give a suffrage speech. This was not easy because in doing this, you would undoubtedly be the object of hecklers. So for a woman to stand up and give a suffrage speech, you were talking about being a public speaker. I mean, this was a public speaker times 10 because you were speaking, in the outdoors to a not necessarily friendly audience. And finally, these campaigns starting in California, the suffrage movement was already 40 years old. It had a kind of old lady reputation, like that picture of Susan B. Anthony, not something you want to look like. And here these young modern suffragists are doing what they can to make suffrage seem modern, fashionable, indeed glamorous. So this is the one on the left. So the one, you can see how much is changing already. Women's hemlines are coming up, their ankles are showing. They have what's called a bob, short hair, their hair is cut. This was the winning, there was a contest for the major poster for the suffrage campaign. And this was the one that won. It was done by an art student named Bertha Boy. And it was, I think it's exquisite. There are many things to say about it. You can see it's very art deco, nouveau? One of those two. And she's wearing a sort of elegant cape. And can you tell where she's standing? What? It's the Golden Gate before there's a bridge, okay? So, and the sun is setting behind her, thus constituting a kind of halo. Okay. Now, enfranchising a women state by state could never fully enfranchise all the women of the United States. In particular, the southern states, still smarting, the white-dominated southern states, still smarting from the 15th Amendment, were never going to let another federal amendment go by which would bring black women into the electorate. So here's, I said there were going to be two different cartoons. This is a cartoon attacking women's suffrage by putting it, by linking it to a terrible set of stereotypes of black women with giant lips, wearing, they're barely women. They've got, see, they got men's shoes. You know, there's nothing womanly about them. And so here's, this, what this cartoon is saying is, you're going to give women the vote, this is what you're going to get. Okay. The fear, the growing fear of bringing black women into the voting population was a response to the growing level of activism and organization among African American women a mere 2 generations after the abolition of slavery. So this is the California State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, 1915. These are several early 20th century black suffragists. The woman on the left is probably, in some ways, she's the kind of Susan B. Anthony of, the African-American Susan B. Anthony. Ida B. Wells, she was actually one of the first women in the United States to hyphenate her last name. When she married a man named Frederick Barnett, she became Ida Wells Barnett. Her primary campaign was to try to get the federal government to undertake a law against lynching, to make lynching a federal crime. My understanding, and you LWV women can tell me if I'm right, that the House has just passed, finally, a law against lynching. It, of course, has fallen into the pit of despair of the Senate. So that's a campaign from the early 20th century. Ultimately, the most important impact that, all right, so by about 1914, something like 4,000 women in the United States, 4 million women in the United States have the right to vote by action of their states. And you can see it's a very regional development. It's all to the west, nothing to the east. So the ultimate way that the votes of women at the state level is marshaled is it's brought back to bear on this question of an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It's like, as it says here, the women of the states who can vote are being urged to use their votes in federal elections to press. This is 1916, so this is Woodrow Wilson's campaign for re-election. And one of the wings of the suffrage movement has gone forward to these women and said, okay, we want you to vote against the Democratic Party and against Woodrow Wilson until and unless he is willing to support a federal amendment, which he was not willing to do. This campaign ran into one little problem, which was the First World War. So the effort to try to get the women of the free states of the West to vote against Wilson came up against the fact that Wilson went into the campaign saying he would keep the United States out of war, which he didn't. But he was reelected on those grounds. And then a month after he's inaugurated, the United States enters the First World War. At that point, this is the most notorious part of the whole 75 years, I think, of the suffrage movement. That same group of women who tried to get Western women to vote against Wilson now start to engage in a civil disobedience campaign. They become the first political movement to picket the White House. And day after day, for something like 8 months, they stand through rain, through cold. They stand in front of the White House, as you can see here. They're standing in front of the White House. And they held up signs. They were quiet. They didn't speak. They let their signs speak for them. Once the United States goes, they start this in about January of 1917. The United States enters the war in April of 1917. At that point, what they're doing becomes more and more controversial, and in fact, they are accused of being traitors. You don't picket the president during a time of declared war. I'm not going to go into this part of the story. You have to read it in the books, nice books that you bought. The real way, I think, is not so much these demonstrators that makes the difference, because we're now in 1917, and as we know, although they don't know this, we're on the downside of the campaign. August 26, 1920 is when the right to vote is going to happen. What really makes the difference, and here we go back to that question of states gaining the right to vote. In November of 1917, the campaign to get women enfranchised at the state level crosses the Mississippi and is successful in the biggest and most powerful state of the Union, or the most populous and most powerful state of the Union, New York. So when New York changes its constitution, it has the largest congressional delegation of any state, and those 43 men, because they're all men, are then, they have to answer to women voters, and they become supporters of the woman suffrage amendment. Soon afterwards, Wilson literally changes his tune. Okay. So now we get to the fourth and final surprise. The first one was the women's suffrage amendment that never was. This one is the women's suffrage amendment that almost wasn't, okay? We know 1920 was when it happened, but I want to try and help you to understand that there was nothing preordained or necessary, and it could have happened that it failed in 1920, as it had regularly for 75 years before. And the United States could have been like that other great precursor of democracy, France, which did not give women the right to vote until after the Second World War. French women did not vote until 1945. Okay, so New York changes its constitution in the election, the off-year election of 1917. And within 3 months of that, the House of Representatives has a full debate on women's suffrage and passes the amendment. Now, I know you're all very good constitutional scholars, so you know that when something passes Congress, that's only the first and second step. The harder one is ratification. Okay, so here's the debate in Congress in January of 1918. So, you know, you'll recognize the well of the House from watching the impeachment debates. But what you'll see there is a woman at the podium. This was a woman named Jeanette Rankin. She was a suffragist from Wyoming, and she had been elected. She was the first woman elected to Congress. And you can see she's another one of these modern women. She has a nice bob, and you can be sure you can see her ankles at the bottom of her white dress. And the women of Wyoming were among those Western women who had the right to vote, and they brought Jeanette Rankin into Congress, where she is allowed to present the bill for women's suffrage. The bill passes the House by exactly the 2/3 number. I should remember how many members of the Congress there were at this point, but without a vote to spare. And now it must go to the Senate. And traditionally, the Senate had been, it's the sort of less explosive house, and it had been the one where suffrage had received a decent hearing all those years before. But in fact, it took another year and a half for the Senate to pass the bill, sending the 19th Amendment out to the states. For more than a year, there were 35 states that had ratified, and the suffragists were short one state. What ended the stalemate was the midterms of 1918, fortuitously 100 years before our midterms of 2018, which were also a bit of a revolution. And this time what happened is the Democrats who had controlled Congress, both houses and the presidency for 6 years, lost control. And at that point, there's an open battle between the two major parties about who's going to be able to claim women's votes. So at that point, they start competing not to keep it back, but to push it forward. Finally, in June of 1919, the Senate passes the suffrage amendment. But now we have the most difficult barrier to overcome. The fact that 3/4 of the 48 states their legislatures have to have to vote in favor of women's suffrage. This barrier, this obstacle is meant, it's why, are there 27 or 28 amendments? Something like that. They're not many in 200 years. That's why amending the United States Constitution is very difficult. And in some ways, why the Constitution is, at least it has been so far, a stable document. Other countries have constitutions that have millions of amendments to them. Ours have amendments that have passed very, very difficult tests. By one estimate, 11,000 amendments have failed to make it through Congress, and 6 have made it through Congress, but not through ratification, most famously the Equal Rights Amendment, which passed by Congress, but not through ratification. 1 year after Senate passage, this is a picture of an anti-ratification campaigner. Okay, you want to see her again? Okay. Not that old guy in the back. So here are, well, this is not a great map, but what I want you to know is that the states that refused, this actually does say the states that refused to ratify. 2 rock-ribbed Republican New England states, New Hampshire, is that Vermont or New Hampshire? Vermont? New Hampshire? Which one's on the left? The white one. That's pretty funny. And Connecticut. But the major obstacle were the southern states, which refused. And in the end, it was a state in the upper South, the blue one, the only one in that pale blue color, and that is Tennessee. where there was, unlike many of the other southern states, there were actually two parties in Tennessee. There was a bit of a Republican Party, and then the major party was the Democratic Party. And so here's the debate. It was in a stifling July week in 1920. There's there's a nice story where there's a male hero of this final story. This good-looking fellow, 24-year-old Harry Byrne, broke the tie in the Tennessee legislature. What's on the left is a letter that actually his actual mother sent to him, telling him to be a good boy and vote for ratification. The governor signed. I guess there's no. Yeah, the governor Colby was the Secretary of State. And he signed it at like 6 a.m. on the morning of August 26th. Let's see, I wanted to say one other, the last state to, so once Tennessee, the 36th state, ratifies, it's part of the Constitution. But it was not until 1984 that the final state did the, ratified, even though by then it was a pro forma act. It was Mississippi ratified in 1984. And then, so that's August, and the goal was to get women voting. So here are women with kazoos and flags, okay? And here are women voting in the election of 1920. So there was a tremendous effort that women, including the League of Women Voters, had to do to get women registered to vote between August and November of 1920. Something like half of the women who were eligible to vote voted, about half, a percentage about half the size of men. But, you know, the number of women, although who had worked for the right to vote, had been numerous. They were only a tiny portion of the female population. And so it's another 75 years between. Finally, in the 1970s, women start voting more frequently than men, which is what's happening now. So that's the story, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
You alluded to Utah. What was the story on Utah?
Yeah,
I know it was before California.
Well, Utah, like Wyoming, had given women the right to vote when it was a territory. And at that time, Utah was a polygamous state, a Mormon-dominated polygamous state. And anti-polygamists were sure that when women had the right to vote, they would use it to get rid of polygamy. And pro-polygamists wanted to show that women were not abused in Utah. But when it comes time for the territory of Utah to apply for statehood, the Congress of the United States actually, you know, Congress has to say that a territory can become a state. The Congress says, we're not going to let you in until you get rid of polygamy. And suffragists made hay of this. They said, Congress won't do anything to give women the right to vote, but they're willing to intrude to keep women from having the right to vote. I believe what happened, I have to double check this, the state of Utah, the territory of Utah outlaws polygamy, and I think they give up women's suffrage and then they enact it a few years after it becomes a state, something like that. All right, so first of all, there's no E, right? It's not suffrage. It's suffrage. It's not the same word as suffer. Somebody told me it was, actually the word was suffer plus rage. No. The word suffrage is a very antiquated term. I think it refers to a kind of religious petition. I should, the next time I do this, I'll have the definition up so people can see it. But By the early 19th century, it's come to mean the right to vote. And by that time, when women don't get the vote in the middle of the 19th century, the campaign for white men's right to vote has, certainly in this country, completely triumphed. And the term becomes pretty antiquated. So it's really only used for women. And it's so old-fashioned that when those 20th century suffragists want to update their movement, they don't use the term anymore. They say that they're working for votes for women. I'll use this to answer a question which you didn't ask, which is suffragist? So suffragette was a term that started in England, and it was used to make fun of women who campaigned for the right to vote. It was to use, like poetess or stewardess, or, to take a word that meant something for men and add a diminutive to it, so that when women got it, it was lesser. But the suffragists of England, especially the militant civil disobedience women, did what many protesters have figured out to do, which is if there's a word that's being used against you, you embrace the word and you drain it of its negative meaning. So if you're gay and you're called queer, you say, damn right, I'm queer. And then it doesn't work anymore as a criticism. So suffragette was the term that the smaller, more radical wing used about themselves. But the majority of advocates called themselves suffragists. So a suffragette was a suffragist, but a suffragist was not a suffragette. Women in England got the right to vote at two different moments. When I taught suffrage to students, and I taught it as an international movement, one of the things I said is that you'd think the date that women got the right to vote would be just a simple fact with no debate. But in fact, there's a lot of vagueness. So sometimes you'll see the date for the United Kingdom. What was it called then? It wasn't called the United Kingdom. The British, I don't know. What?
Is it still the Empire?
No, but it was, what? Great Britain, yeah, let's say it was Great Britain. Was 1918. And that was right after the war. And women were enfranchised, but only so many women that would not be more than the men, because a lot of men had died. So women over 35 or women who had lost husbands in the war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not until 1928, 10 years later, that all women are enfranchised. So I think the British tend to use the 1918 date, but it's not the right date. Thank you all very much. Thanks for coming out.